All of these military adventures have been at the conventional level, and they've been kept at the conventional level because of the existence of nuclear weapons. So they've had to turn away from the concept that that level of warfare could be used to advance various goals because the destruction involved in it would be so great.
Destroying people and personal property are one thing, but when the power elite and their governments are also annihilated, that's inhumane. Given this, the founders of the League of Nations and the United Nations were probably the first to read Report from Iron Mountain because they quickly realized they could no longer use the profitable war system to maintain governmental authority. Something new had to be devised. By 1967, a replacement for the war system was on the minds of not only UN bureaucrats, but the heads of state, high-level politicians, government officials, diplomats, scientists, economists, and business leaders from around the world. In short, the power elite was now desperate to find a new unifying principle.
And they looked at things like, possibly we could create, we could make everybody believe that we were under attack from aliens from outer space. Now that would scare the dickens out of everybody. They certainly would be willing to undergo any kind of sacrifice and loss of freedoms if it was necessary to defend Earth against Martians or something like that. And they talked about it at great length. That they said, very interesting possibility. Let's consider that. Let's not put that off the table.
Then, in 1968, Aurelio Pache, David Rockefeller, and Alexander King founded an organization they called the Club of Rome.
Founded by members of the great and the good, members of the, to use the conspiratorial terms, the globalist elite, who produce fatuous documents from time to time, echoing the various mantras and nostrums of socialism or communism at a particular moment.
The club floundered around for a few years trying to solve the problems of mankind. But then, in 1972, it revised an idea spawned by Thomas Malthus in 1798. Malthus was an English scholar who wrote a book entitled An Essay on the Principle of Population. Basically, the principle was this: every time the human race invented a way to produce more food, it used the abundance to increase its population rather than improve its living standard. Thus, humanity never advanced like it could if a small elite were ruling a modestly populated world.
Malthusianism was, in a sense, a theory or a counsel of despair, that as people gained technological knowledge to produce more food, that would make them to a certain extent more healthy, and they could reproduce at a faster rate as opposed to dying off quickly. And the population would then expand, potentially geometrically, and this would outrun food production, and so you had this vicious circle which could never be corrected.
The club, using computers of the day to extrapolate not only population growth but resource depletion, came up with a twist on Malthus and published it in a book entitled The Limits to Growth. Like Report from Iron Mountain, Limits to Growth was also a bestseller. The twist was this: human populations grew exponentially while food populations only grew linearly.
And the Malthusian population model, which is a simple equation, simply says that if there's enough resources, the population will go on doubling until there isn't enough resources.
In other words, the human race was going to run out of food and deplete its resources. This, the club warned, would lead to a sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity by the year 2072. Very plausible, many thought. After all, when Malthus wrote Essay on the Principle of Population, the world population was only 800 million. Now, when the Club of Rome published Limits to Growth, the world population was 3.8 billion and still growing exponentially. Given that war could no longer be used as a unifying principle, perhaps the threats posed by overpopulation would fit the bill. This idea excited the power elite and initiated a UN conference in 1976 in Vancouver, Canada, known as Habitat 1.
This was the beginning of a series of meetings that they had at the UN starting clear back in the 1970s.
And this is where sustainable development was defined as human beings must not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs.
It was kind of an intellectual way of explaining why the world needed world government, because without world government, individual governments couldn't handle all of these really big problems that now needed to be solved on a global scale.
So they will have resolutions and they will take actions that will impede the population growth of the world. Let's get back to basic freedoms given us by God Almighty, which is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence.
Out of this conference materialized a 54-page report called the Vancouver Declaration on Human Settlements, more of which we will discuss later. This report outlined a theory of how to address overpopulation's effects on the environment and natural resources, a way to balance the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of future generations. Again, what they called sustainable development.
Now, it was realized very early on that population wasn't growing as fast as Malthus had predicted, and that what's more, the natural resources we were able to command and the increase in yield from crops, for instance, was far greater than anything he had ever factored in. The one thing that actually works is to raise the standard of living. And of course, that is the one thing that the various globalists and population freaks are desperate to stop. They don't realize that by making people poor and keeping people poor, they do create a population problem which would immediately cease if they made people rich and allowed them to be rich and allowed them to hold their own property.
Finally, it was decided. Sustainable development was to be the new unifying principle to replace the war system. All of this, Malthus, World War I, League of Nations, World War II, United Nations, atomic bomb, hydrogen bomb, Iron Mountain, Club of Rome, Vancouver Declaration, and Brundtland Commission are the stepping stones to Agenda 21, the action plan for sustainable development.
In 1992, in June, George H.W. Bush signed or agreed to the United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development Plan.
It was a bad night in Rio. Before the ink had dried on Agenda 21, Bush 1 had signed the document.
It was not a treaty, it was not a law, it was what they call soft law. It's not something that actually is debated by Congress or by state legislatures, but it's implemented through the federal branches, through the HUD and EPA and OSHA, and also through state governments and county governments. If you brought back a treaty, the Senate would have voted on it, it would have been debated, there would have been information about it, and I would think it would have been voted down.
It was also a bad night for the United States, because on that night, in the year 1992, we the people were enjoined with what would become the largest land grab in history.
There were 50,000 delegates there. And of those 50,000 delegates in Rio de Janeiro, there were 179 heads of state, including George H.W. Bush, and plus diplomats and UN executives and so forth, and this massive number of non-governmental organizations that wrote these documents in the first place.
They designed Agenda 21 to be a, quote, voluntary agreement, not a treaty. So it didn't have to go before Congress, it didn't have to go anywhere. It just got done by President Bush's signature. What happened when he signed it was it mobilized every federal agency to adopt plans, programs, and mass amounts of money to the implementation of Agenda 21 on a local basis.
Zoning laws of every imaginable type on every level of government would soon be marching across rural and suburban America in the name of sustainable development.
And, this was a bad night because what he was signing on to and saying, hey, this is a great idea, he was completely going against the Constitution of the United States, the freedoms that it was designed to protect, private property, free enterprise, individual choice, George Washington would have whacked them in the head.
Then, in 1993, non-binding Agenda 21 became binding when Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 12852, launching the President's Council of Sustainable Development.
And it was tasked with implementing all of the plan within the United States. So although you'll hear that this is a dusty plan that's not really, it's voluntary, it's non-binding. In fact, this plan is binding on you.
They said, oh, this is just voluntary. If a community wants to follow some of these guidelines, well, that's up to them. They can just do that. On this council were every single agency of the federal government, pretty much, representatives of NGO organizations, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, the Audubon Society, groups like this that helped write Agenda 21 at the UN level, and representatives of global corporations. They all came together in this council for one specific purpose, to take the ideas, the voluntary suggestions of Agenda 21, and make them law of the land. So when this happened, this argument that, oh, it's just a suggestion, went out the window. And what they did, the NGOs that wrote Agenda 21 in the first place, wrote the grant programs for HUD, for EPA, Department of Transportation, and they put in those grants small print that said, you take this grant, you will have to do this and this and this, which was the implementation of Agenda 21.
Like a cancer, Agenda 21 started embedding itself into every cell of the federal government and on down to the state governments.
That was in 1993, and that directed every federal cabinet officer to have a program for the implementation of Agenda 21.
Between 1993 and 1999, as Americans slept, sustainable development concepts and laws infiltrated every county, township, and city as federal and state grants, more realistically bribes, flowed with abandon.
Sustainable development interjected itself into states and localities through the use of monetary bribes, to be quite blunt. If these localities wanted to obtain money for certain projects, they had to sign on to projects that had sustainable development aspects to them. Somebody's brother-in-law made money in putting in that extra layer of asphalt and paint and so forth and so on. And that was the reason it's there.
And how they've actually gotten it to our local cities is through these carrots, the stick and carrot of giving federal highway safety transportation funds, as an example, to implement areas of sustainable development.
And that is pursued through 4 presidents, to include Donald Trump, to today.
Then, in 2015, after the UN enumerated 8 major goals for sustainable development at the 2000 Millennium Summit, Agenda 21 was officially updated to Agenda 2030.
The 70th session of the General Assembly has opened with a towering achievement. The adoption of the 2030 Agenda, including 17 inspiring Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
Agenda 2030 now specifies 17 major goals for the world to reach by the year 2030. The long march through rural and suburban America continued.
And so, of course, this is a devastating thing to the United States and to other nations that value freedom and their individual rights, because this plan is completely antithetical to the concept of individual freedom.
Now, in 2019, we have the Green New Deal breaking out in the public domain for the first time, openly pushing the goals of both Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030.
When we have this threat that challenges all of us, the solution is going to take all of us too.
Everywhere you go across the United States, you find evidence of sustainable development. Even in this water here, it talks about sustainability.
So this is really, no matter how they describe it, it's a fundamental transfer of sovereign power to the United Nations from each of the member countries in the United Nations to be exercised through control over land and other natural resources.
Like the gay rights movement before it, Karl Marx and the socialist movement have now come out of the closet naked and charging. The United States is immersed in an action plan that may have started out with some good intentions, but now subjects we the people to the threat of a Marxist world order.
Climate change is the #1 reason for the implementation of Agenda 21.
The world's population has been growing exponentially because of the agricultural revolution and several industrial revolutions fueled by oil, coal, and natural gas.
You don't have to haul wood and go and chop trees and do all kinds of hard work, stuff that is really provided by science and technology.
But, per Malthus, humanity does not use industry-created abundances to improve standards of living. It uses abundances to increase the size of the population. This leads to poverty, starvation, resource depletion, and eventually a degradation or a destruction of the environment, something common to us all. But the biggest threat to the environment, according to the power elite and its apologists, is the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere due to the burning of fossil fuels. This CO2 buildup is causing the planet to warm, the greenhouse effect. If CO2 reaches a critical point, whereby it causes a condition of runaway warming, Earth could become like the planet Venus, complete with a 900-degree surface temperature and no life. Global warming would thus be an existential event as bad as global thermonuclear war. Given this, one has to admit the power elite has made a very good argument, if their facts are correct.
The sun and H2O, water, have a far, far greater effect on the climate of the planet and how hot the planet is than CO2 does.
This then brings up the argument of whether the warming from the sun is causing a CO2 buildup or whether CO2 buildup is causing the warming.
In the past, we have CO2 10 times, 20 times higher than what we have at the present time. One of the most well-known examples is to study the carbon dioxide content in the air bubble that is trapped in the ice core from Antarctica. When you study that record carefully, you find that it is always, I emphasize, that is always the temperature that is changing, rising or dropping first before the atmospheric carbon dioxide respond to it. When algors, when they try to talk about this topic, they always wave their hand like this, left and right. More carbon dioxide, temperature warm. When less carbon dioxide, temperature cool. But they forgot to tell you this is basically wrong.
For every scientist who says global warming or CO2 buildup is bad, you can find one that says global warming and CO2 buildup are good. One scientist says that global warming is causing the polar caps to melt. Another says global warming is making the planet more fertile.
If we take the CO2 that was originally in the atmosphere and is now in the form of coal and oil and gas, and we burn that coal and oil and gas to generate electricity or to make steel or aluminum, then what happens is we release the CO2 that had become locked away in the rocks, and it goes back into the atmosphere. There, the trees and plants like it, and they are taking up more than half of all the CO2 that we emit and turning it into leaves and trunks. You can see it happening all around us. Trees and plants, if you're any kind of a gardener, growing more rapidly than ever because CO2 is plant food.
Yet another says sea levels are rising and flooding coastal cities. Another says a warmer planet means a longer growing season, hence the ability to grow more crops and remedy poverty.
If you study this very, very carefully and you ignore all the politics, that's what science is supposed to do, and you don't get your hand tied and your mouth completely controlled by the UN mouthpiece, then you will reach the conclusion that quite a substantial part is actually explained by natural component. The more sunlight you have, you will warm. You will evaporate more, and then you will evaporate water vapor. That causes the greenhouse effect. Water vapor is the primary greenhouse gas versus CO2, which is always known in any textbook as a secondary or tertiary greenhouse gas.
A number of years back, we had climatologists tell us that the world was not warming. It was cooling due to the dimming effect of particulate matter in the atmosphere. With this discovery, the term global warming was converted into the term climate change. Talk about hedging your bets.
Look at the question of particulate matter in the atmosphere. What is the effect of that? How much of it? Where is it moving? What is it? What kind of things are it? Volcanoes. Volcanoes emit carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, sulfur trioxide, carbon monoxide. Think of all the elements and compounds that are emitted. What is that effect?
Whether or not climate change is an existential threat, the United Nations is marching forward and using it to justify the central planning of not only the land, air, and water, but all resources, plants, animals, and humans on the planet, as we discussed earlier.
The global elitists who are currently in power want people to believe that carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, first, is a tremendous problem. And secondly, they want us to believe that the cycle of the amount of carbon dioxide that happens to be in concentrations in our atmosphere is driven by human activity.
The real problem here is that there's a political driving force behind what they call climate change, which is once again the desire of the UN through their general sustainable development theories to gain increasing control over the way industrial society operates. Then you really have a kind of a stranglehold on every country in which the United Nations can exercise this kind of power.
And that is why most governments around the world, because all of them have their totalitarian streak, have gone along so gladly and so readily with the storyline that global warming is going to happen at a rate sufficient to cause danger, and only the government can save the environment from the people.
The solution is always more government control, more taxes, and less freedom for you.
In their words, they are doing this through a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations system, governments, and major groups in every area where humanity impacts the environment. By organizations of the UN, we mean the World Trade Organization, the World Court, the World Bank, and non-government organizations like the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, and Wildlands Network.
NGO, or non-governmental organization, is actually an official position in the United Nations. They apply for that privilege to be part of that. Once they are accepted as an official NGO, then they're able to participate behind the scenes in these numerous UN meetings and help write documents. And in their minds, these NGO organizations are our representatives in the UN. So they're looking at a global governance, and the people's voice are the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, and Planned Parenthood, and others in their mind. That's how they look at it.
By governments of the UN, we mean the UN's 193 member states, as well as ICLEI, also known as Local Governments for Sustainability.
ICLEI, the International Council on Local Environmental Initiatives, is an international group. It calls itself Local Governments for Sustainability, but it's really not a local group at all. It is an international group. It's made up of thousands of cities, and we're talking about huge cities. We're talking about San Francisco, London, Tokyo, New York, Rome, the largest cities in the world, as well as many, many smaller cities. In the United States, over 1,000 cities are members.
ICLEI is basically a full-service organization for sustainable development. It's a network of 1,500 plus cities, towns, and regions in over 124 countries, headquartered in Bonn, Germany. Effectively, ICLEI is a UN-spawned foreign government operating in the U.S. across jurisdictional boundaries.
It's a foreign organization based in Bonn, Germany, that has infiltrated not just America, but countries all over the world for the purpose of implementing Agenda 21.
ICLEI, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiative, founded in 1990 at the UN, is a government entity. It is made up of governments, and states are forbidden by Article 1, Section 10 to form alliances or confederations with foreign entities. They can't make treaties, for example. And so any town or any city or county that belongs to ICLEI is a violation of Article 1, Section 10.
Well, Article 1, Section 10 says that states may not engage in treaties with foreign governments. The only treaty power is in Article 2 of the Constitution. The President negotiates treaties and then the Senate advises and consents on their ratification. The fact that ICLEI is registered in Bonn, Germany, immediately raises the question of an international operation that's going on here. The very fact that it's located overseas should point up that we have a problem with these activities being adopted by states and localities, because the Constitution of the United States prohibits, if you will, any state from entering into a treaty with a foreign government or a foreign entity of some kind. So really this is kind of an end run that's being done by the United Nations through ICLEI essentially to camouflage what's really going on here. And it's simply amazing that more people in this country don't raise that question.
And the question becomes, under Article 1, Section 10, can such a party engage in domestic activities? And the answer to that is no. And they're bringing in international organizations in order to advance that interest. And I say to that, if you're sitting on the city council, you have an obligation under the Constitution, and then it must cease. If you don't do that, you become duplicitous.
If you know or believe that someone is committing a felony, you are required to report that to some official. It might be a judge or someone else. And if you fail to do that, then you are guilty of the crime of misprision. All right? You have a duty as a citizen to report criminal activity. Well, here we have what looks like a very large-scale operation going on internationally to subvert governments of states and localities, and ultimately through them the government of the United States, on behalf of the United Nations, various foreign powers within the United Nations, the people behind the United Nations, anyway, international concert of action. And one would think that people in those localities would be able to say, wait a minute, we think what's going on here is felonious conduct. They're in violation of various state or national statutes, and we want to take this to the appropriate official under our misprision statute. That might be a judge, it might be a local prosecutor, whatever. We need to do that. And then when those people are confronted with that charge, they are supposed to take action. But as far as I know, no action of that kind has ever been taken.
The UN has established or inspired global and foreign networks, organizations, groups, and governments to infiltrate the U.S. at every level and effectuate the principles of sustainable development, with or without the American public's knowledge or consent. Unsustainable.
We're not being told about these plans, and yet it impacts even our breath as I share this with you. And so, you know, I'm super excited about this Green New Deal thing, because finally people are seeing, wait a minute, there is an agenda going on, and what is this thing all about?
So what you're seeing though with ICLEI and with your metropolitan planning organizations and your councils of government that are literally all over the United States, what you're seeing is regionalization in action. This is how it's implemented through this organization, which is looking for ways to restrict your ability to use your natural resources and to have you rezone and re-general plan the center of your town so that it can only be used for very high density development. This is the purpose of organizations like this, to regionalize as an interim step to full globalization.
Instead of the human civilization expanding and boldly going into an infinite universe of real estate and energy, We are supposed to shrivel up on a planet under the UN's precautionary principle, a principle that considers all human activity and advancement dangerous unless proven not dangerous.
You can't move forward unless you can prove there's no harm. And so it demands that the government step in and say, well, there might be long-toed salamanders on this land. There might be. So you can't do anything until you can prove that there isn't. And of course, you can't prove the negative. You can't prove there are no long-toed salamanders. So the edict is, and it's used very conveniently for whatever excuse they may want to use it for, to simply stop people from using their property.
Under these new environmental laws ushered in by ICLEI and other foreign agents of the UN, all manner of federal grants were and still are being given to states, counties, townships, and cities in order to literally bribe officials into implementing Agenda 21 and its battle cry of sustainable development.
Whenever a higher level of government makes a grant and it looks like a bribe, is because it is a bribe. It's also a threat. It's a means of acquiring addiction on the part of those receiving the grant. Once you get a person or a state at any level addicted to this easy money that's coming in from up above, they get to the point where they forget how to live on their own means, their own income, their own tax base, or whatever it is. And they're totally now dependent on the source of the money. So without anybody voting for it, without any change in the laws, without any revision in the Constitution, all of a sudden, whatever separation of power there was disappears. And it's the old saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Most of the U.S. population is not aware of any of this, especially Agenda 21. They are only aware that suddenly there is some new zoning law that inhibits their ability to get a building permit, requires them to pay 20% of their renovation budget for a wheelchair ramp or an elevator for the handicapped, or suddenly the stream across their street must be remediated and the state will be sending down a grant of $130,000 for the local officials to allocate as they see fit.
Every single issue that we face, whether in your community when they're doing the comprehensive plans, if you have a program to put in bike paths, if you have a program to control how buildings are constructed, and they always tell you it's local, local, local. One of the biggest problems we have is the use of facilitated meetings. Facilitated meetings are run by a professional facilitator who is trained in psychology, and he is trained, here is where this meeting's going to go. This is the outcome we're going to have. And he knows how to lead that meeting to exactly that outcome. But then they say, oh, the community decided this.
They actually create the plans for visioning meetings that direct how it is that your government is going to change the center of your town to the smart growth or new urbanism model, so that it'll be higher and denser. It's what I call vertical sprawl. And of course, they do your climate action plans where they're monitoring, metering, and controlling what it is that your emissions are. In order to manage your emissions, then they have to monitor them regularly and continuously. So this is the way this plan is designed. It's designed as a continuous loop for monitoring, metering, and managing the entire energy output and use of the world.
Before now, have you even heard of ICLEI? What about COGS, MPOs, or the ADA? How about human settlements or the Biodiversity Treaty? You are not alone. Few have any idea how the cancers of regulation have invaded the land of the free.
And when Agenda 21 not only uses our government as a tool contrary to our rights, but brings in foreign law and foreign influence to dictate upon the people and their states unlawful exercise of power, we are operating completely contrary to our established America. We're operating completely contrary to the rights of the people, and we will be destructive of our own future.
The Biodiversity Treaty was unleashed at the Earth Summit along with Agenda 21 in 1992. This treaty is considered key to sustainable development, and it sets forth the following rationale. The human race cannot sustain itself if it is polluting the water, air, and land of the planet due to overpopulation-induced CO2 buildup and fossil fuel-driven industrialization. Since the biosphere of Earth depends on an intricate and interdependent hierarchy of species, it does not make sense to antagonize or destroy the environment. This is reasonable, but what is not reasonable is extreme environmentalism.
This is the Biodiversity Treaty. It is 1,147 pages thickness of what is and is not sustainable in the 21st century. It talks about unsustainable things that human beings do. For example, power lines, ponds, fences, paddocks, religion. It talks about the unsustainability of the future because of population. It talks about golf courses, scuba diving, all these wonderful sports and skiing and all these things that we do as human beings. It's all unsustainable.
The Biodiversity Treaty was originally the brainchild of a radical environmentalist named Dave Foreman. He was the head of an organization called Earth First. He put together what was called the Wildlands Project. The Wildlands Project called for rewilding, their term, 50% of all the land in every state, back to the way it was before Christopher Columbus. Foreman's goal was to reduce the population to about 250 million people, and one of his dreams was to have the gray wolf and the grizzly have an unbroken line from Chihuahua, Mexico to Canada.
The Wildlands Project is one of those things that just sounds so crazy you can't believe that it could possibly be true. And it's the idea, which seems like a good one, that human beings should be restricted to specific locations and animals should be free to move freely through the world. And so because of that, then you have designs that require corridors, which are animal corridors, core areas for animals, and buffer zones. And these surround the islands of human habitation.
Under the Wildlands Project, vast tracts of land throughout the United States will be returned to the wild. Few or no humans will be permitted on tracts of land that could span the nation from Los Angeles to New York, Canada to Mexico. Humans can visit, but they cannot stay.
Take rural lands and put it off limits to human beings. We see that beginning to happen right now. Roads are being closed. Forests are being more limited. And the idea here is that you stack and pack people in metropolitan areas, you put them on public transportation, and you never let them outside.
Human beings are irresponsible. We are planetary villains, and therefore we need to create this Wildlands Project, a network of cores and corridors that are given, where the animals, the species, the plants are given priority over human beings.
And this is the goal: islands of human habitation, or human settlements, or transit villages that concentrate human beings into specific locations so that animals can be free to move freely throughout the world.
All human development and support services, including roads, power lines, dams, farms, ranches, police, and firefighting services, will be gone. Only wolves, suckerfish, spotted owls, and indigenous species will remain.
Extreme environmentalism is what we're seeing coming out of our colleges and universities right now. So the Biodiversity Treaty attempts to, in many cases, it will regulate to one species to the complete detriment of all others.
South San Jose is a good example of what's become, or is becoming, a wildlands project. South San Jose is called the Coyote Valley. And gee, Some coyotes like to cross that valley, and some other animals as well. And so that's off limits to development. And we're seeing that kind of activity happening everywhere across this country.
But where will the humans go? Not to worry, Agenda 21 and its spawns have a plan. Recall we mentioned the United Nations Habitat 1 plan that came down at the Vancouver Convention in 1976. Under this plan, all humans that once lived on farms and in rural areas, so-called wildlands, will be relocated to cities, now referred to as human settlements.
And the idea is that if you concentrate populations into specific areas or zones, less energy usage, less water usage, and less transportation. So people will have less reason to leave home. They'll stay in their homes. They may even work out of their homes. And so they're not going to be using their cars. They're not going to be using energy. And they're not going to be using water.
Since, as we saw earlier, the UN is not big on property rights, it should come as no surprise that the first private property to be phased out will be single-family homes, what socialists at UN headquarters consider suburban sprawl. Instead, we the people will live in apartments and condos in megacities near railroad tracks. Our super-tall dwelling units will all be built to UN-specified building codes authorized by ICLEI, COGS, the ADA, and a myriad of NGOs and other friends of sustainable development. While the animals run wild in continental corridors, we the humans will live in transit villages and smart cities.
Smart growth, or new urbanism, is that ideology that says that you shouldn't have more space than you actually need. So if you're a couple of people living in a 3-bedroom house, well, you don't need that extra space. So why do you have it?
There's a clear, concerted effort to make it really just about as miserable as possible to exist and use your own private transportation, own your own home. All impetus and incentive, in financial and otherwise, is to convince people that it is unsustainable to live in your own home, have air conditioning. It is their duty as a human being, as a global citizen, you see. You basically exist and little more.
Our high-rise, stack-and-pack dwelling units, complete with smart meters and smart heating systems, will make sure no one uses too much energy. And if they do, the energy police, with help from the neighbors and eye-on-the-street surveillance systems, will be right there to handle the situation.
If they can put 1,000 people in one building, it's a whole lot easier to know what they're doing, where they're going, and how they're thinking than it is if you got 1,000 people living in a rural or suburban area. And so the stack and pack is multi-story buildings, multiple families living in the same spot, walking in and out of the same door, always being able to be managed. And smart meters play a big role in that management, as they can measure everything that you do in your life when you're using smart appliances.
If you have a garden or a single-family residence, while you're watering your garden, you maybe have more than one bathroom, you're taking too many showers, you're using more than your 10 gallons of water a day. And this is unsustainable. So you need to be removed from your single-family residence.
Anybody that's got a couple of acres of land and his own water supply and can grow his own food, these people are a threat to the collectivist society, because they aren't going to go to the politicians and say, please feed me, please clothe me, please give me shelter. That's the secret behind Agenda 21. They want people out of the country. They want corporations out there growing all the food and that kind of thing, but they don't want anybody living out there.
To describe human settlements and the food sheds that sustain them as modern-day concentration camps might be a little over the top, because with no cars, parking lots, or air travel, everyone will walk and use bikes, so they will be fit and healthy. At least as healthy as the genetically modified foods they are forced to eat will allow.
These islands of human habitation are surrounded by, of course, the continental corridors that wild carnivores can use to repopulate the continent, and all continents, in fact. So human beings aren't going to really want to be going out there into the wildlands area. And they're, of course, if you're a locavore, which you should be, under this plan, then you're not going to be getting your food from more than 25 miles away. And so that means that your transit village or your island of human habitation needs to be ringed by a food shed. And the food sheds, or of course you can grow your food hydroponically in a sort of a multi-story concrete parking garage kind of thing that you get your food in. But your food sheds are those rings of land that are around these islands of human habitation. And they have a limited amount of calories that they can produce. And if you're limiting the numbers, then you have to ask yourself, well, who gets to live there? And let's say you want to get married or have a baby. Do you have to wait for someone to leave or die?
In a universe of infinite energy, where the sun burns 4 million tons of hydrogen every second, and a gallon of seawater can be fused to provide the energy density of 300 gallons of gasoline, no good citizen would even think about using or wasting energy when sustainable development came to their neighborhood.
So it really is, how do you control where people live, and how do you get people living in these highly dense areas? Because according to United Nations Agenda 21 and these power elites, you and I need to be living where we can save planet Earth by living in a high dense community. And it's happening all over the United States.
But getting all the humans off the rural lands will not be easy. The UN's cohort of governments, NGOs and COGs, including the US government and hundreds of ICLEI-supported local governments, will have to do a lot of land confiscation. Not an easy task unless they're able to disarm the US population first. Luckily, a police state, especially a global police state, has many platforms and tools that cut across jurisdictional boundaries, as an ICLEI website proudly states.
In order to control mankind, we have to get them all into the big cities. We have to rack them up and stack them up, get them dependent on the state for their food, their shelter, their electrical power, their water, everything. That's the dirty secret behind Agenda 21.